David Turner sat at the small table in the corner of the bar, the dim lighting casting shadows on the walls around him. The hum of conversations and the clink of glasses filled the air. But for David, it was nothing more than background noise. It had been a long day, another round of errands, another day spent fighting for some semblance of normalcy after his years of service. His legs were still healing, still weak from the injury he sustained during his last tour. But the chair, the mobility, was just a tool for survival now. He took a sip of his beer, glancing over at his old friend Tom, who sat across from him, looking over a menu. The two of them had served together overseas. They shared stories, memories, and scars. They didn't need to say much anymore. The silence between them was always comfortable. The bar was quiet tonight, but there was something about the group at the back booth that felt off. Their voices were too loud, their laughter a little too rough. A bunch of young guys, cocky, overconfident, drunk off their own bravado. David could feel it, the way they kept glancing at him and Tom, like they were sizing them up. He didn't think much of it at first. It wasn't unusual for people to notice the Marine cap on his head or the old military jacket draped over the back of his chair. But then the comments started. "What do you think, he's some kind of hero?" one of the young men said, his voice brash and loud enough for David to hear. Tom didn't even look up, his eyes still on the menu. The laughter that followed the comment was sharp, mocking. David didn't bite. He ignored it. He had learned to, in the service, focus on what matters. But then the man, still laughing with his friends, muttered, "Look at that guy. Probably thinks he's still a Marine." David felt his pulse quicken just a little. That one hit a nerve. "Maybe we should show him what a real man looks like," another man, much bigger than the first, added with a wink. David's hands gripped the edge of his beer bottle tightly. He didn't like the tone. He had been in situations like this before, back home, at bars, and especially in places where people didn't understand what it meant to serve. But this felt different. This wasn't just disrespect, it was a challenge. Before he could fully think about what to do, the man who had first spoken, Tyler by the sound of it, stood up from the table. He stumbled a bit, his balance off from the alcohol, and sauntered over toward David's table with that confident swagger only a drunk young man could pull off. "Well, well, well," Tyler said, looking David up and down, as if sizing him up for a fight. "What's this? An old vet, huh? You think your service still means something in here?" His words dripped with mockery. "You're a little far from the front lines now, aren't you?" David stared at him, his gaze calm but sharp. "Don't engage, stay focused." "I'm just here for a drink," David replied, trying to stay steady, his voice firm but controlled. "Just a drink?" Tyler scoffed. "How many drinks did it take for you to forget you're just a broken down old man?" He laughed again, his buddies chiming in, egging him on. David's fingers twitched on the armrest of his wheelchair, but he didn't respond immediately. No need to escalate. He had seen too many situations go wrong when the wrong words were thrown in anger. But Tyler wasn't done. He leaned in closer, his breath heavy with the stench of cheap alcohol. "Tell you what, old man, why don't you give me one good reason why I shouldn't take you outside and show you what real strength looks like?" At that, the air in the bar shifted. A challenge had been issued, and this time, it wasn't going to be ignored. Tom, sensing the tension, looked up from his menu and opened his mouth to speak, but David was already standing. Well, rolling, technically, his chair moving toward the group with a steady, calculated grip on the wheel. Tyler's smirk deepened, but he didn't see what was coming. Without warning, David's calm voice broke the silence. "I was a Marine before you even learned to walk, kid, and I'm still a Marine. So, unless you're ready to back up that trash talk, I suggest you sit down, or I'll make you." Tyler paused, eyes narrowing. His bravado faltered just a little, but the group around him laughed and slapped him on the back, egging him on. David didn't wait for another word. He moved faster than anyone expected, rolling right up to Tyler and stopping inches from his face. The group fell silent, the laughter suddenly dying down. "Here's the deal, kid," David said, his voice now low and unyielding. "You want to see real strength? I'll show you what it looks like. But know this, when I'm done, you'll understand that some fights aren't worth fighting. And this?" He gestured to the group, to the situation at hand. "This was never the fight you thought it was." Tyler blinked, the cockiness on his face starting to crack. The tables had turned, but none of them realized just how seriously outmatched they were. Tyler stood frozen for a brief moment, his eyes darting back and forth between David and his friends. For a split second, it seemed like he might back off, his earlier bravado starting to fade under the weight of the veteran's calm, unshakable presence. But then one of his friends, Mitch, a big guy with tattoos covering his arms, slapped him on the back. "Come on, man, you gonna let him talk to you like that?" Mitch's voice was laced with challenge. "Get him, show him what you got." The group's confidence surged again, fueled by their collective arrogance, and suddenly, Tyler squared up, his chest puffing out. "You're just a damn cripple. What are you gonna do, huh?" Tyler sneered, his voice sharp with renewed aggression. "You think you're still a hero?" The words hit harder than Tyler realized. He had no idea the monster he had just woken up, the man he was mocking. David's eyes hardened as the anger, the kind of focused rage that had lived inside him for years, rose up within him. He had fought wars. He had been in places most people couldn't even begin to imagine. And yet, here was this kid, mocking him, mocking everything he had sacrificed. In that moment, it was no longer about the insults. It was about teaching them a lesson they'd never forget. David rolled his wheelchair forward with swift precision, his eyes locking onto Tyler's face. The group watched, frozen, their laughter gone, replaced by a feeling of unease. They had thought they were dealing with a man who had long been broken, who had lost everything, but they couldn't have been more wrong. David's voice was steady, controlled, but the steel behind it was undeniable. "You want to know what real strength looks like? You want to understand what it means to fight? Let me show you." He didn't wait for Tyler's response. With one swift movement, David propelled himself forward, using the strength in his arms to shove his wheelchair into Tyler, knocking the man back a step. The impact wasn't enough to knock him down, but it was enough to disarm him, to show that David wasn't as weak or fragile as they assumed. Tyler staggered back, his smirk wiped away in an instant. "What the hell, man?" he sputtered, holding his chest where David had pushed. The rest of the group took a step back as well, sensing something had shifted in the air, something dangerous. They were used to dealing with people they could bully, with easy targets. But now, they realized they had underestimated the veteran who had been sitting so quietly before. David's voice was low, but now it had a hard edge, a raw command that came from experience. "You think this chair makes me weak? You think because I'm sitting down, I'm some kind of joke? I earned every bit of my uniform, my scars, my service, and I don't need to stand to make you regret what you said." Tyler, trying to regain some semblance of control, took a step toward David. But before he could act, David slammed his hand on the armrest, the force making a loud sound against the wood of the table. The group froze. "You've already said more than enough." David's voice didn't raise, but it carried with a quiet intensity. He looked at each of them. "It's not about strength, kid. It's about respect. And right now, you've lost that." Tyler opened his mouth to respond, but David didn't give him the chance. He leaned forward slightly, his wheelchair rolling just a few inches closer to Tyler, and then, with an almost impossible speed, David stood. It wasn't a long, graceful movement. It wasn't meant to be, but it was powerful. And for a moment, the entire group stood in stunned silence as David used the strength in his arms to push himself up just high enough to tower over Tyler, his gaze unwavering. Tyler's eyes widened in disbelief. He had expected to see a broken man in a wheelchair. What he saw was a fighter. The strength in David's eyes was undeniable. David didn't say another word. Instead, he sat back down slowly, resuming his place in the chair. But his presence was no longer the same. It was different now. He wasn't just a man sitting in a chair. He was a warrior, one who had been through hell and come out the other side. And these kids, they didn't understand that kind of strength. David's actions had told them everything they needed to know. There was no need for violence, no need for further confrontation, just the sheer presence of a man who had lived, fought, and survived, and who was not willing to let his honor be disrespected. The group stood motionless for what felt like an eternity. Tyler and his friends, once so full of arrogance, were now unsure of themselves, their bravado gone. They had gone from mocking a veteran to realizing they were facing a man who had seen far more than they could ever imagine. Finally, Tyler broke the silence, but his voice was no longer cocky. It was small, almost ashamed. "Look, man, I didn't know. I didn't mean it." David simply nodded, his gaze steady. "You didn't have to say anything, but you did, And now you've learned a lesson. Respect doesn't come with a uniform, and it's not something you take for granted. Tyler didn't know what to say. He had been handed his pride on a silver platter, and now it tasted bitter. As the group started to leave, heads low, David stayed at the table for a few minutes, watching them go. He wasn't looking for apologies. He wasn't looking for recognition. But he knew one thing. He had taught them something today. The bar began to fill with noise again, but it was quieter this time. There were no more laughs at David's expense. The veteran didn't need to say anything else. The lesson had been given. David sat there for a while longer, finishing his drink in peace, knowing that the world wasn't always fair. But sometimes, the right person can change the course of an entire situation. And today, he had done just that.